Hey everyone, J-Man here, and today I'm bringing up what's arguably the most controversial topic so far on this channel. To simply lay it out on the line, I 100% believe that 120 RPM hand cannons should be reverted to their original 110 RPM state. And as crazy as that sounds, I bet after watching this video you will be on the fence with this decision just like me. But before we dip into the meat and potatoes, let's take a brief look at the history of hand cannons in the Crucible sandbox that ultimately led to the introduction of 120s. Prior to the annual DLC Beyond Light, hand cannons were broken up into 4 archetypes. From lowest to highest rate of fire, we had 110s, 140s, 150s, and 180s. At this point in time, 150 RPM hand cannons dominated the meta with champions like Spare Rations and Dire Promise ringing in an impressive time to kill of 0.8 seconds with no damage perks. That, of course, was with the famous 3-tap or 3 headshots to secure a defeat. Having 4 different types of hand cannons created some tricky PvP balance challenges for Bungie to overcome. If we break down the 110s, 140s, and 180s, none of them were able to compete with the time to kill of 150s. 180s took an entire additional shot for defeats, already making them pretty obsolete, and since 110s and 140s had lower rates of fire and no real stat advantage over 150s, they basically sat dormant for quite some time. It was clear to Bungie that they had to make some drastic changes to hand cannons in their archetypes, which led to the following game-changing decisions. 150s being too dominant were straight up converted into the 140 RPM archetype and given a range increase. 110s were converted to 120s and were also given a range buff. 180s had an increase in magazine size by 37%, but received no additional stat buffs. Sunshot, being the oddball out, was left to be the sole remaining 150 RPM in the game. Going into Beyond Light, it was pretty unclear what the new meta was going to be, especially from a hand cannon perspective. Would 140s take over the role of 150s? Would a completely different weapon class like pulse rifles reign supreme? Well, as you would guess from the title of this video, 120s ended up taking over the meta and still do to this day by a long shot. The double buff between rate of fire and range has enabled 120s to be extremely effective from close to long range combat. And while they feel great from a base stat perspective, it's actually not the primary reason I think they should be reverted back to 110 rate of fire. The main reason this change should occur is because of how 120 RPMs react to damage buffs. When a damage buff is active, 120 RPMs decrease the amount of shots needed for a defeat, giving the hand cannon the ability to defeat a guardian with 2 headshots. This effectively brings the time to kill of a buffed 120 to an astonishing half second. No other primary archetype in the game has a status effect where you need to click the trigger less times to get a kill. So, for comparison's sake, a 140 RPM hand cannon still requires 3 shots when buffed. Oh, and let's take a quick peek at all the ways you can receive a damage buff in the Crucible. Weapon damage perks like Swashbuckler and Rampage. Warlock's Empowering Rift with an honorable mention to the Boots of the Assembler exotic paired with Lumina. Bubble Titans with Weapons of Light. The Stasis Fragment Whisper of Hedrons, which grants a damage buff when freezing an opponent. And of course, Charged with Light plus high energy fire, including all the ways you can easily get charged in the Crucible. Heck, I'm sure I'm even missing some ways from this list, but at the end of the day, I feel like I'm getting just as many kills while damage buffed than not. In my opinion, Bungie has 2 options to even out the playing field for 120s. Option 1, nerf damage buffs overall by either reducing the amount of ways we can receive a damage buff in the Crucible, or reduce the amount of raw damage increase received. Or go with option 2, revert 120 RPM hand cannons back to their 110 state. Personally, I really like the way Charge with Light and damage buffs work in the Crucible, and I would hate to see some of these features removed because of one outlier. For all other weapon archetypes, it doesn't cut the time to kill down as drastically, but rather gives a slight advantage in an engagement. Plus, many of these buffs require team coordination and mod builds just to make happen, for example, combining your super activation with Radiant Light. It's just an extra strategy that adds some objective and flair to the Crucible. And I know what you're thinking, why not just nerf the base stats of 120s? Well, as a matter of fact, Bungie already did that since Beyond Light. At the start of Season 14, Bungie reduced the range stat of 120s, yet still, they dominate the Crucible due to their low time to kill while buffed. To me, folks, reverting the RPM to 110 but allowing the weapon to retain its 2-tap ability is the way to go. This means that all other weapon types can still enjoy the variety of damage buffs in the Crucible, while 110s are still viable and not nerfed into the ground. Let's also not forget that 110s no longer need to compete against 150 hand cannons that used to make them obsolete. So I'm curious to know if this conversation has you on the fence of bringing 120s back down to 110s. If you have a different opinion or a different way to balance this hand cannon archetype, I would love to hear how in the comments below. Also, if you happen to have enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like or even subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the Cosmodrome.